Welcome everyone to the Polarian series of webinars. Today's presentation, the impact of ALM software on your medical device compliance. Today we are excited to offer you an engaging panel discussion with two medical device industry experts. Our first panelist, Griffin Jones, is a consultant for context-driven software testing and regulatory compliance with companies in regulated and unregulated industries. Recently, he was the Director of Quality and Regulatory Compliance at iCardiac Technologies, which provides core lab services for the pharmaceutical industry to evaluate the safety of their potential new drugs. Our second panelist, Jamie Cole, leads the Global Technology Center at iCardiac, which consists of a team of talented and motivated technology professionals responsible for the Compass software platform, iClinica clinical trial management systems, and IT infrastructure. Jamie has also spent over 20 years in software development with Eastman Kodak, most notably at the Kodak EasyShare software team in the digital camera division. Our facilitator today is Red Struck, product manager with Polarian Software. I welcome our panelists, and I'll turn the agenda over to Reg.
I'd like to take this opportunity to be able to briefly describe who Polarian is and what we do. And then we'll get into the interesting part, the meat of our presentation, an open discussion about regulatory software and the impact on medical devices. So quickly, an overview of Polarian. We're a globalized software company. We actually located in Stuttgart, Germany as our corporate office, and then we have actual offices in San Francisco, Prague, Canada, so all over the place. We primarily focus on software that is for the application lifecycle management area, and then we clearly have requirements management, quality assurance, and test management software, and then also we have what's called cloud-based products as well. As I mentioned, we're located all over the world, across continental Europe, Asia Pacific, Brazil as well. Our primary product is Polarian ALM, which is, again, as I mentioned, is the application lifecycle management product. But as you'll see is that we are actually a requirements-driven company, and as well as test management as well. So what we'll start with is we'll open up our discussion with what we all would like to hear about, and that is regulations and how they apply to both software and software industry and medical devices and the production of medical device software. So I'd like to welcome again both Griffin and Jamie, who are our expert keynote panelists, and welcome, gentlemen. And I'll start off with, let's talk about regulations and software. First is, how about we talk about medical device software, so the production of software for medical devices, and the use of medical device software for managing and creating your medical devices.
All right, so this is Griffin Jones. One of the interesting things about medical device software is, in particular, and actually all regulated industries, is that they're regulated for a reason. Due to most of the people that are probably participating in this webinar understand the reasons why, which is people are either going to lose so much money that they care about it, or people are going to die, potentially, if there's a misdesign or a misapplication of their particular devices. So they're high-risk products, and therefore the government has, through law, put together a series of regulations that manage the way that people actually market these devices into the industry, develop them, and support them in the field. From an FDA point of view, the primary ones are around 820, which is a medical device piece, or GXP, GMP, good manufacturing practices, or all the other different flavors of good something practices, clinical practices, for example, which are all essentially attempts to take reasonable engineering processes and have some appropriate degree of standards and assessment that an outside person can confirm that the particular people are creating products in a way that it's appropriate for the public to use them. When I worked with Jamie, we weren't making a medical device at that particular time. At that point in time, we were creating devices being used by the pharma industry.
Yeah, I think the section of the general principles of software validation that always gets my attention when we start talking about applicability to medical device software is in section 3.1, actually titled applicability. And it has 4 bullets there. Software that's used as a component, part, or accessory of a medical device. The second one is software that is itself a medical device, such as they give the example of blood establishment software. And the third one is software that's used in the production of a device, like a manufacturing controller or equipment. And then finally, I think where we're going today is software that's used in implementation of the device manufacturer's quality system, which is software that plays some role in recording and maintaining the device history record or the design record you might want to talk about.
We did actually publish a poll, and that poll is which standards provide you the most difficult to achieve. Interesting enough, a lot of focus on what the FDA is focusing on. And let's talk a little bit about your thoughts on IEC 62304. So Griffin, did you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'll go briefly, but the really interesting one is Jamie has some interesting experiences. So Jamie and I were in iCardiac creating a device for the pharma industry at that particular time when 62304 first came out. And that was the first real instance that we could find where the agency gave some regulatory guidance about the applicability of iterative software development in terms of how to apply that into particular tools. And in the subsequent years going forward, there's been a lot of energy in terms of the medical device companies that I've been working with in terms of figuring out how to apply that particular approach into their particular environments.
The 62304 was very well timed for what we were doing in a way of having an FDA-recognized structure of software development lifecycle processes that we could use in any kind of lifecycle, be it a waterfall approach or an agile approach, taking everything from software development planning to software release and configuration management, risk management, et cetera. So definitely a nice layout, and also I think, as we'll talk about in a little bit, also has the typical classifications you have for the varying types of risk that you want to apply to software.
The interesting about 62304 is that it really demonstrates the commitment of the agency towards reasonableness. So the expectation is that you're the expert on your particular product. You're the one that knows how to build it. Provide us appropriate documentation that demonstrates that in a way, but you have flexibility in how you do that. And that's the biggest change, figuring out how to apply flexibility in a controlled engineering fashion is the interesting aspect about how to apply 62304 into a particular org. Okay,
it's great. This is all great insight on the IEC 62304. Moving on, we touched a little bit about software validation. In particular, it's the parts of FDA Part 820, Part 11, and I'd like to actually maybe get some more of your thoughts and experience on that particular focus of the FDA's Part 820 and Part 11.
Yeah, well, for our software development experience, most of our experience with the 820 was the part around design controls. So, Griffin, if I'm correct, it's Section 30 of the 820?
I don't have it.
Is the design controls?
I believe you're correct, yes.
And what's nice about that is a lot of the design controls in Part 820 are embodied in the 62304 standard we were talking about. So in many ways, you can look at both for setting up your quality system. And then Part 11, I think you and I could probably talk about for several hours, and I'm sure our listeners would be happy to listen to that. But we have lots to say about Part 11. And Part 11 compliance for some of these software products can be a challenge, and we have to go back and talk about the risk approach that we take before we get into that.
Yeah, Part 11 has a lot of, and how you validate Part 11, given application lifecycle management tools, is a critical aspect. The whole verification validation aspect of how to do that on a product development group is a challenge. Figuring out how to do that in a manual way is usually difficult. You usually need to use some type of tool to help you through that particular process. So in terms of folding this back into using like tools that help you manage this particular process, the aspects of keeping the books and showing the traceability and the accountability of all the different engineering artifacts as they're created through the design and development and deployment, quite frankly, of your products out into the field is one of the advantages of having tools and being able to generate reports that you can then share with external people, for example, that help demonstrate Part 11 compliance is pretty important.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. All right, let's move on to the next slide. I want to also point out to our attendees that feel free to ask any question you might have in reference to software and regulatory. In particular, we have two credible experts here that would be more than happy to answer your questions. So feel free to actually engage us through our chat.
Yeah, asking questions in the moment is good for me.
Great. Okay, so it's a good segue. We didn't plan this, but you were talking about traceability, Griffin. And what I'd like to do is, for those who might not even be aware of it, what is traceability in respect to regulatory requirements?
Yeah, so at least in FDA, the idea is the agency is concerned about two things, requirements and risk. And from a requirements point of view, what they're looking for is a clear traceability from your highest level product requirements or software requirements all the way through your design and out to some type of demonstration evidence or testing evidence that shows conformance to what you assert that you built. If you're demonstrating that your product actually works the way that your requirements state that it should be working, that's verification. If you're demonstrating that you can actually get clinical results according to the purpose that the end users want, that ends up usually being a verification or a validation activity. So the traceability aspect, often it's talked about as a traceability matrix. All it is a double linked list that points backwards and forwards from design inputs to design outputs, all the way from requirements out through the evidence that confirms the assertion of those particular requirements. You can do it in many different ways. You can use it old-fashioned way with numbers in Word documents that point to other documents, or you can use tools that will help you through this particular process. I know that when Jamie and I worked together, we actually did it in a couple of different ways through our period of time.
Why is it so important? And how can software actually improve managing traceability? Oh my gosh. Yeah,
Jamie, you want to?
It reminds me of the communication law. What was it? What's the law about how many links of communication you have back and forth with the number of people to the end or something like that? But what gets unmanageable is the number of connections of your requirements to your detailed design and on down to your code. So knowing that it's so important to know that a change in the future, how it's going to impact the design and the integrity of the design, unless you have a full-fledged traceability matrix. And, like Griffin alluded to, you can do it many different ways. We all start maybe with index cards and Scotch tape and have these things connected on the wall somewhere in our office, or we have a spreadsheet, or we have a more sophisticated database to keep track of it. But the idea is that you're going to connect these things from requirements to detailed design and the associated tests, and then sometime in the future you're going to make a change, and you're going to be able to understand the impact of that change by going back and reviewing this traceability matrix.
We completed our poll here as well, and what's interesting, Sarah, is that overwhelming majority of people that answered it actually said that they performed traceability in a very manual process.
Okay.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
The good thing about using manual processes is that it's very difficult to build systems that get wildly out of control. It also creates good habits and behaviors inside the people when you're doing it manually. It's also tailorable to the way that you actually work. So that's all good. But using an automated tool in some fashion, what you're looking for is not to replace all that human expertise. What you're looking to do is augment that expertise with the power of what the tool does really well, which is it never forgets, it's consistent, and all the other advantages of using an automated tool. The difficulty that I've run into with folks is two extremes. One, the people that are just not sufficiently concerned about maintaining traceability, and that will eventually get them in two ways. Either from a regulatory point of view, the agency will detect that and there'll be a problem, and it'll highlight the fact that they weren't serious about traceability and the ramifications that has. Or, frankly, it's difficult to run your business if you don't have reasonable engineering control over the different components and understand how these different artifacts influence each other, especially when you start making changes down the road. So that's kind of why it's important, why you eventually start to move towards a tool. The other way, so that's one way. The other way is people that tend to jump directly into tools without understanding what they're doing or having a manual practice beforehand, tend to go way overboard in terms of using all the capabilities of the tool. which creates problems. So personally, I like people to evolve into using the tools after they settle their practices.
I'd like to maybe get some thoughts from you, or maybe some anecdotes or examples of some of the, I wouldn't necessarily say the horror or the difficulties, maybe the pitfalls of either improper or lack of traceability.
It was Metcalfe's law. It's proportional. It's proportional to n squared, so the number of nodes or number of connections in your traceability matrix. Think of a conservative example of take a high-level requirement and trace it to 5 sub-requirements, each of which maps to, a procedure in code, and each procedure requires maybe 5 test cases for validation and verification, okay? And, when you start to add that up and figure out how challenging that is to maintain that, you would have to track the one-to-one and one-to-many and many-to-one mappings from the original requirements through the decomposition to the sub-requirements, procedures, et cetera. And it could get onto, several hundred, sometimes several thousand test cases. So for us, definitely, depending on the complexity of the software, we had a software component with many features and procedures that we were discovering along the way. And as we developed the test cases, we're a little bit optimistic as engineers. We don't think it's going to be as complicated as it turns out to be at the get-go. So when you get into it, if you don't start it out from scratch, you're already behind. So I guess the anecdote for me is that I wish I had started such a traceability matrix at the onset, because we were digging into some code that was delivered to us from some research that was done locally, and kind of going on a mining expedition. You didn't know what was around the next corner or under the next layer, and it got to be quite a bit. So definitely my advice to the folks listening in is that you want to start such a traceability matrix early on.
Yeah, absolutely. Some horror stories that I've seen are examples where you go into a supplier or you're working with a client, and you start looking at their documentation around traceability, and you start discovering that all the documentation was essentially generated in the last month of this one-year project. And you start digging into the why, and it's because they really didn't create and baseline those artifacts through their particular process as they were going through that process. Instead, they try to bolt on traceability at the end of the process and show that traceability through that. And as an external person looking at your particular product and thinking about whether or not I want to incorporate it inside my medical device, it makes me start to wonder about the accuracy of that particular documentation in terms of describing how you actually build things, because you're really running a separate process to generate all that documentation. Then at the end, if you create the documentation around traceability, it meets the requirement, but it's not really meeting the spirit of what they want traceability for, the purpose that the agency wants. And as when I check my suppliers around traceability, what I'm looking for is a demonstration that people are under control, that their engineering processes and the products that they're creating are under control. Now, that doesn't mean overly prescriptive necessarily. Things have to be reasonable, but it's important that the traceability is a way to clearly demonstrate that the organization understands their responsibilities around how they're creating the product and not just focusing on the final deliverable.
Okay, great. All right, we'll move on to our next topic. And this one's actually lots to discuss here, but let's talk about risk-based software validation. So, a little bit of a loaded question here, but in your opinion, what is RSBSV?
Well, I'll give a short answer, then Jamie can chime in about what we actually did at Cardiac. So risk-based software validation is, first of all, it's a basic recognition that testing is an infinite problem, that you can't actually test everything into the product, that the scope of the things that you could theoretically do is so huge that it's not possible. So once you finally come to that conclusion, you realize that testing is actually a sampling problem. And since it's a sampling problem, the question is, well, what is the criteria that we should use around choosing what to test and what not to test, what to validate and what not to validate? And so that becomes an issue of taking a look at what the agency has talked about around how to do risk evaluation and casting that or focusing that particular approach on your particular product, and using that to sort of drive in terms of what are the priorities, what are the risks of this product, and focusing your efforts on confirming that your product and your processes are working to address those particular needs. We did this quite a bit at iCardiac. You want to talk about that, Jamie?
Yeah, the approach that we took at iCardiac was to evaluate our software product based on something that is in one of the guidances here. I'll come up with it in a second here, that talks about level of concern. So software level of concern is defined as major, moderate, or minor. And the end of the story for the software products that we were working on at iCardiac is that they were minor level of concern, which is defined as failures or latent design flaws are unlikely to cause any injury to the patient or operator. So I think you have to evaluate if failure is going to result in serious injury or death, or it would be a major level of concern. A moderate level of concern obviously would be something in between minor injury to a patient or operator. And so these major, moderate, and minor levels of concern, we also mapped into the 62304 standard for the types of deliverables that we would produce for the design documentation. So you'll see a kind of match of class A, B, or C type of software defined in the 62304 standard.
I've been working recently with a lot of Class 2, Class 3 medical devices, which are ones that if they fail, people are going to die or fail catastrophically. Some of the products that I work with, quite frankly, are with seriously ill and sick patients that are incredibly fragile and are not tolerant to significant machine failures. So given that, the way it ends up working is that we go through that particular product and we do failure mode and effects, looking for the types of failures and looking to mitigate or prevent those particular problems from an engineering point of view, using the technology or using other aspects to mitigate those particular pieces. So we identify risks and then we talk about how we're mitigating those particular risks. And we approach this both from a top-down and a bottom-up point of view. As you move up the scale of risk in your product, you end up having to apply stricter risk mitigation strategies like failure mode and effects analysis or other types of analysis in terms of the risks that are contained in the product. And then you have to demonstrate that you take them seriously, document that what you're doing to address them or mitigate them, and then provide proof that they're actually effective. This is also fairly important when you actually release it into the marketplace and you start getting feedback from the field about concerns or other issues that are happening with your product in the field. Part of that analysis ends up influencing the way that you analyze the particular risks in your product and determining whether or not you need to make changes to your particular product due to failures or concerns identified in the field.
You hear a lot about COTS, which is obviously commercial off-the-shelf software. Maybe some thoughts on that. We're going to talk more about ALM, obviously, in detail, but could either of you want to talk about COTS in general and then maybe some of the types of software that either to use or not to use?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of sentences and I'll let Jamie speak to it in a direct fashion about what we did. In my experiences with different companies around medical devices, this is usually a blind or a concern spot. There's lots of things that are incorporated inside the software stack, the application stack, that are commercial software where we have no idea what the content is. And frankly, the agency wants some demonstration that you understand what you're doing, that you've made some assessment and confirmed that it's appropriate to use that particular product with all its flaws inside your particular software device, medical device. And they're looking for evidence that you've applied some type of engineering assessment and you have evidence that it's appropriate. Many people struggle with this because it's detailed, it's tedious, it's not that hard, but it's time-consuming. It seems like it's obvious until you find out that there's like some Windows problem in a version you were thinking of using that would seriously jeopardize the results that your particular product would create. This has a lot to do with some of the concern the agency currently has around mobile applications and running them on different types of mobile devices.
You know, you said something there, Griffin, that is really important. It's some things that, you know, aren't always obvious, and some things that you take for granted is that you're using COTS software around your software development process, and maybe like you said, it may be part of the actual software product that you're developing as well, that you need to take a step back and evaluate for the purpose of satisfying the agency that you've done so. And that's a really important step.
Yeah,
and
actually,
so
you make a really good point right there in terms of emphasizing COTS is also all the things inside your development environment and your support environment. If they're somehow influencing that medical device, then they're in scope for being under control.
Yeah, it definitely is, and I think that's something we wanted to talk about today is that the software development environment that you're using and the way it treats the records, quote unquote, that you use for documenting your requirements, documenting your design, documenting your test cases, architecture, all of that is oftentimes done by using commercial software packages. And these things, we're expected in this profession, in this industry, to take a look at how we're using these tools and these software packages for our medical software and evaluating, the risk, the applicability that, we talked about earlier for validation. And I have good news. And the good news is you and I and anyone who's in the software development business gets to define and document what it is that's important to us and what's appropriate for our business. We know our business the best of anyone, and we have that liberty and that luxury to be able to define it. So the good news is you can define this and document the applicability of these software packages in your business as you see fit, but it is something that you want to do and to do comprehensively. It is a bit tedious, as Griffin mentioned, but it's worthwhile because it gets you to a point where you have taken stock of all of the software packages that you're using and really evaluating the applicability of the validation process.
It's also regulatorily required to do it, so that makes it easier in some ways. Advantages and disadvantages?
Yeah, we can cover those too.
So
I know you covered a bit of the advantages.
Yeah, so the advantages of having a risk-based approach, first of all, it's a sampling problem. So you're going to have to, you can't do everything. So given
That's
that.
right. I like that. It's a sampling problem.
It is. So it really comes down to documenting what your approach is. And so when people come and ask you what was your rationale for what you decided to do and what you decided not to do, you can actually explain it to third parties. Hopefully you also follow it, and you can use that to explain your particular approach inside your own organization. It's just a demonstration that you are thoughtful about the risks that are in your product, and you're being appropriately diligent in terms of finding where those particular risks are. I get concerned about people that don't take a risk-based approach, because what that means to me when I come in and audit them is that things that really don't have risk are now taking up resources of this time and people and other types of resources of this organization, which means that they're not doing something else that is risky, which makes me start to wonder about, are they under control? Do they understand the risks of the product that they're dealing with, et cetera?
All right, let's move on to our next topic. All right, so ALM. So maybe talk about, in your view, what ALM is.
Above and beyond what you described?
Yes. It's always nice to have it from a non-vendor perspective.
Back to my primitive model of, everything could start with index cards and Scotch tape. The whole process of planning and documenting your software project can be facilitated greatly by using an application lifecycle model, application lifecycle solution. And I know there are many good products out there that facilitate this. And one of the biggest benefits of using such a solution is back to what we talked about earlier about traceability. And if you do something like this up front, where you have your requirements definitions, you have your design documentation, you have your references to code and test verification documented in such a system, it becomes much easier to manage it and to generate and maintain the traceability throughout the design.
Yeah, well said. I agree with that. The thing that over time has become even clearer to me about why you want to use some type of tool to help manage this is the maintaining. Having used mostly manual paper-based systems or manual but electronic type of systems, there was always that fear as I was setting up for the audit with a third party of, is it all still there? Did we misfile anything? Can I find everything quickly? And having to maintain all that particular, the integrity of the particular system required diligence on my part and the people inside the organization to make sure that it was there. Having the tools over time, as you become successful and release more things, having the tool do that maintenance for you is a huge advantage that you don't fully appreciate until you have 7 years worth of records where half of them were written by people that aren't even in your organization anymore. It's really makes it easier to sleep at night knowing that the tool is doing that through the power of what automated tools do.
Okay, Jamie, how would you, from a perspective of actually medical devices, how would you see ALM software such as Polarian's ALM applied to medical device from a regulatory perspective?
As I mentioned, the traceability aspect, the Part 11 compliant aspect of the record keeping for the design, and that relationship to the design controls section that 820 calls out. So there's a lot of application to the medical software and medical device software area, and it's, everyone just needs to keep in mind that it is, because it is a software package that's used in keeping track of your software design, it does have to be validated, on a risk-based approach. So whatever type of solution, if it's the Polarian solution or whatever you may have, you certainly want to be able to demonstrate to a regulator or to your client that you have the capability to properly control the records around your software design using that type of a solution.
Okay, so we talked about, you both touched upon the fact that the control documents and so on, the artifacts and auditing and traceability. What about process? Do you see advantages in using ALM for in the process of producing medical device solutions?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. There's a wide spectrum of the way people implement process across the different tool sets. Some of them take a very rigid approach, and the tool dictates what the process is going to be for that organization, and it's really not tunable. I have difficulty with those systems as opposed to like Polarian, which has a much more open and configurable type of process flow through their particular software set in terms of the way that you design the different artifacts and how they move from design input to design output. Use the tools for the things that they do well and use people for the things that they do well. The tools are fantastic for having automatically routing information through a defined workflow. So for that 80% of the things that are just going to just flow through the workflow, the tool helps that. It does all the traceability for you with your work, but it maintains it for you. It deals with signatures, which is usually a big deal, especially when you're a distributed group. It handles the ability to attach checklists or some other type of thing when you're doing the assessment. There's aspects around using the tools that just take a huge burden off the cognitive load of the people that are trying to do this work.
The next question here is, what are the drivers that, in your opinion, indicate you should be looking at or using an ALM solution?
Organizations that are, especially, obviously software organizations that are getting sizable and multiple projects going on at once. So the number of projects, the number of people in the organization can be a big driver for considering an ALM solution. The traditional 2 guys and a dog in a garage developing software as a startup may not apply. However, when you're trying to develop a robust process in the medical software industry, you may find that you want to invest in an ALM solution from the get-go. It kind of depends on the risk and sophistication of the software you're developing. I think, at iCardiac, for the type of software we were developing and have been developing and the size of the team, we're at a point right now where an ALM solution would make sense. And think about what Griffin just said earlier about, rely on your people to do what they do well. Your process can be defined by the ALM solution or your people, and just kind of finding that sweet spot of when it's time to make that investment. You can usually hear the cries of the staff when they say, "Boy, this is really getting to be a burden and becoming difficult, and something fell through the cracks there that we should have caught." Those are probably good indicators that it's time to invest in a solution like that.
Yeah. One of the dangers is if your staff is really good, you can go really far into a risk area without necessarily knowing it. So they can keep non-tool supported processes kind of working right up until the point that they fail with a catastrophe, they collapse. So sort of being aware of where you are and what the risk is of the current process and tool set you're using is important. I like the list you gave, Jamie. The one that I would add also is one thing that's kind of weird about medical devices compared to other industries is that we have to keep our design records around for like 17 years plus. So like a really, really long time. And if something very bad happens, all of those records will be pulled and gone through with a fine-tooth comb, and they need to be all accessible and be able to be understood and read. While many people can put together manual processes that can support that type of scrutiny over 3, 4, 5, maybe even 8 years, going over a decade with the transitions about the number of people in the organization, when you have that degree of length of time, makes the use of the tool really important. It supports that longevity, that accessibility to the records, the ability to actually retrieve them. So that's one piece that I have become more appreciative of over time.
Great. Okay, Griffin and Jamie, you've both been involved with regulatory in the medical device industry, and in particular healthcare as a whole for many years. What, in your opinions, is the things that you should be looking for qualities, I would say, for lack of better terminology, in looking for an implementation of an ALM solution?
Can I go first, Jamie?
Yeah,
okay,
well,
I have strong opinions on this one. ALM solutions tend to be sold in two different ways. One is to the corporate executives, and then it's pushed down on all parts of the organization. And those are usually gigantic, expensive, one-size-fits-all, jack-of-all-trades solutions that have incredible feature sets. That's not my particular favorite. I prefer solutions that actually solve problems for technical teams. So the other way that they're sold is they're highly specific and configurable to the problems that the particular organization that's doing the work is trying to solve. They also, the good ones also have a structure such that you don't just buy one gigantic blob. You can buy separate components that solve particular problems, and those particular individual components solve very specific problems in the ALM space very, very well. And then that means that you can tailor your solution to the problem that you're trying to solve, as opposed to the problem that the tool vendor wanted you to purchase.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like, finding your own requirements for a new software project that you're starting. And, Griffin and I, when we would talk about requirements, and I'm sure Griffin is quoting someone else when he would say this, but he would say, "Jamie, go get me a rock." Oh. Right, Griff?
Yeah,
and
let's like get a rock.
What color? What, how big, how heavy? And, it's like shopping. Yeah, it's like shopping for a car sometimes, they're all just cars, right? And let's just go buy one. But take them for a test drive. I believe that the manufacturers of these systems allow you to have demo or trial versions of them, or some look and feel experience with them. So I would recommend cutting your development team, your quality team loose on investigating them, looking into them, see how well they dovetail into your already existing process, or maybe some ways in which they open your eyes to some parts of the process you didn't realize that was missing, and that can be very instructive as well. So to me, it's back to the traceability aspect. I think what I've seen is we fall short on maintaining and managing.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jamie, that you were making. When people are considering these, they should be, you should really be doing a pilot. You should be using the actual software, not some crippled version that someone's given you per se. And then the I is really how well does this fit in your particular processes compared to having to change the way you work to fit what the tool expects. And then having an eye towards scalability and maintainability over time is the ones that I usually get involved with. I'm usually interacting with organizations that have had these types of tools or types of these solutions 3 or 4 or 5 years later when it didn't quite work out the way that they thought it would. And then we're making some type of tuning to those systems.
Right. Okay, great. Believe it or not, we're already near the end of the hour. It went by very quickly. What I'd like to do is combine both any lasting words of wisdom you have, as well as the resources that we could, from your perspective, that people could go to for what we talked about today.
So you put up the first ones up there. FDA has some wonderful guidance up there. Also, people in the industry, Twitter can point you to some places and some of the other folks. I know that Reg and I will be at Star East, so if anyone's down in Orlando, Florida, I believe it's in April, they could stop by and talk to us. I know that I'm also running a workshop on regulated software testing on Friday at Star East, and you can show up and attend that if you'd like.
Yeah, those are great ideas. I also recommend getting to know your counterparts in your local community of businesses and find out what they're using. And there's a couple of companies here in the Rochester area that I've reached out to and had some really entertaining and engaging conversation around use of these tools. And every group is different. Every business is different, but you can really gain some insights by spending a little time with your counterpart in another company if you can strike up that relationship.
Okay, and also I just wanted to emphasize the fact that if you go to the Polarian website, there is actually an area that is dedicated to medical devices and some great case studies on how ALM software in particular, obviously Polarian software, helps in assisting in meeting regulatory needs. So don't hesitate to look at that as well. Sorry, Griffin, you were going to say?
Yeah, there's one other, the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society is also a good place. I find it interesting having conversations with medical device people and pharma people simultaneously. That organization is very good, has excellent resources, is full of experts. Highly recommend that group.
Okay, great. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for today's panel discussion. There was a lot of great questions. I hope this was useful to our attendees. Feel free to send us questions afterwards as well. Thank you. Thanks, gentlemen.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.